A very good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to this webinar on the topic An Introduction to Climate Change Policy in India, being hosted by Neeti Manthan. Today with us, we have two speakers, Ms. Vidya Ann Jacob and Ms. Shikha Singh. Ms. Vidya Ann Jacob is an assistant professor, School of Law, Christ, Bangalore, and has been associated with the institution for the past 5 years. Vidya ma'am has completed her BA LLB from Bangalore University and her LLM from School of Law, Christ, Bangalore. Ma'am has been a part of various projects funded by the Karnataka state government and National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. Vidya ma'am was awarded the Fulbright Kalam doctoral scholarship during the year 2019-2020 at Lewis and Clark School, Portland, Oregon. Her research focused on the USA, on how the USA has adopted different climate resilience mechanisms to address climate change. Ms. Shikha Singh is a scientist at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, Pune, Ministry of Earth Sciences, Government of India. Ma'am is a Fulbright Fellow 2019-20 and is currently pursuing her PhD from IIT Mumbai. Ma'am works on understanding the upper ocean physics as well as climate models within the Indian region. Also with us today, we have Nitish Rai Parwani, Director Neeti Manthan, Madhav Gavri, Convener Neeti Manthan Summer School, and my co-lead on this project, Architi Batra. The agenda for this seminar is as follows: to understand the basics of climate change policy, to gain an understanding of the legal situation pertaining to climate laws in India, comprehend the scientific considerations to be made while envisioning a climate change policy in India, and lastly, understand the major impediments to the creation of climate change policies in India. This seminar will have the following format. Firstly, we will have a 20 to 25-minute lecture by Assistant Professor Vidya Ann Jacob ma'am. Secondly, we will have another 20 to 25-minute lecture by Shikha Singh ma'am. And lastly, for another 20 to 25 minutes, we will have a question and answer session. If anyone has any questions during the course of this seminar, please do post it on the chat box, and we will be accepting those. And everyone, please remember to keep your videos off throughout the course of this seminar. Without much further ado, I ask Vidya ma'am to start the lecture.
Thank you, Ajit, and thank you, Mr. Nitish, for giving me this opportunity. Welcome all. I'm really excited for this lecture, one, because the topic that all of you are working on is very close to me, and I really hope all of you would be able to do your best. And if of any time during the project, if you need any help, kindly let me know. I'll be more than happy to do my best to ensure that your paper goes forward to the policymakers or to our legislators. I don't know if you're able to see my slides. Are you able to see my slides? Just to check.
Not yet, ma'am. You need to click present now.
Okay, I will just do that. Just a little present now. Okay, fine. Is that better? Can you guys see the slides now?
Yes, ma'am, we can see the slides.
Okay, perfect. So before I go into the whole dynamics of climate change policy in India and what is the position right now, and I'll also like to take this opportunity to welcome Ms. Shikha, and it's completely a pleasure to share the platform with her. As policy drafters, or as law students, or as Masters of Public Policy students or development studies students, we never look at the scientific aspect. And that is one flaw that we always are pinpointed at the time when we present our papers or when we present our policy framework. So I'm really happy to have Ms. Shikha with us just to help us and to pinpoint where the lacunas are so that we could bridge that particular gap that we're missing out. So just to start off, so basically, if you look at the climate change policy or the situation in India right now, we have already faced with a dramatic or drastic climate impacts, and being a vulnerable country, and we have no say to most of what is happening because it's nothing in our hands. And if you actually look at the climate negotiations that have started off from 1992 onwards, or even starting from 1972 in the UN human environment debates that India has been party to, we've always stated that our importance is not been environment problems, it has always been poverty reduction or eradication. And that has changed for us over the past decade. If you look at how we've gone forward in the Paris Agreement, and how we've also taken up most of the load of the nation and internationally to state that we're going to be upfront leaders to combat climate change, is a huge step for a developing nation like India. So what we need to look at when we look at our climate policies is, are we actually being very ambitious? Are we able to meet the immediate goals? And how are we going to be role models for the future? Considering the back out of the US government from the Paris Agreement, right now, most of the burden lies on us. And India is been showing tremendous growth. So if you look at it from an overview, or if you look at it from a general perspective, India is doing really well. And our national action plan on climate change that we actually put forward in 2008 has been a very good framework or an outline for us to move forward. But is it enough or not is another important question that we should be looking at. Now, when we look at climate policies, there are three important framework or three important components that we should always keep in mind before formulating it or even analyzing it. First, what is the vulnerability quotient for India with regard to climate impacts, be it a municipal way, local way, or state, or by a country perspective? What is our position? Second, to look at the development focused action. So if you look at a country like India, we are a growing economy. So development is something that we cannot stop. Like how the industrialized countries are saying, okay, we're going to move out of the reduction of energy. We cannot say that at this point of time. So how do we interlink development and climate change is the second important aspect that we should keep in mind. And the third is India's engagement with other countries. So what is important for us, not just domestically, but we should also look at how our foreign policies are going to be enacted. How are we going to ensure that the diplomatic relations are going to be still strong, and at the same time ensure that we're going to be a role model for the other developing nations? So one of the key aspects that we should be looking at or we should be addressing is energy components, because as a developing nation, we are going to use energy, and there's no hard and fast rule to that. We are going to use energy, and how much of it we don't know, because our future is still very, very at a nascent stage. So as a developing nation, energy is very important. And at the international negotiation, you'll see that most of the debates right now are revolving around the consumption of energy. So how do we balance that? As much as India says we're going to invest more on renewable, move to an extent, move away from fossil fuel, one of the problems that we have is we have to be open about the financial needs and the technological know-hows or technological exchanges we require. So we cannot do away with both of these. So we need to find a middle path as to how to cater to that. So those are the three main broad frameworks that we should keep in mind before we go forward or before we address the climate policies. Moving ahead, the scientific considerations, well, Ms. Shikha would be addressing that, but I'm just going to give you how it's going to play an important role from the policy perspective, or what are we supposed to be looking at. But once Ms. Shikha's lecture is over, maybe I would be in a better position to bridge the lacunas in the law and the scientific evidence. But right now, what we as policymakers look at, or if you actually look at the IPCC reports or the emission gap reports that is given by the UNEP, everywhere what they're talking about is the concentration of the greenhouse gases and the other pollutants in the atmosphere. So even when we're looking at the Paris Agreement, what we're looking at, how do you reduce the emission to below 1.5 degree Celsius from the industrial level is what we are aiming at. So when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, scientifically, you need to know from where this emission is coming. Is it only from the human activities, or is it even is it also a phenomena of nature? And that is something that we need to bifurcate. The reason being, we cannot control the natural environment process of emissions. But what we could do is regulate the human activities and the emissions from industrialization. So even when you look at emissions, you would also be looking at the atmospheric level or the capacity that is there in the environment. Second, the land usage, how much of burden can the land use right now? So if you actually look at most of our analysis or most of the reports that have been submitted, it states that the Earth's capacity is overburdened. We don't have any more space for any more waste. So the next thing what people have to look at is, how do you treat the waste before dumping it into air, water, or to land, or to your land coverage? Then another thing that they look at is the population versus the land coverage area. How much of land and resources is left out? And depending on these essential features, you can develop a climate model suitable for domestic and international level. So scientific consideration is a very, very important driver for robust and very what do you say, pragmatic, or a more practical climate policy framework. So even when we look at a climate policy framework in India, as such, we already have one, and I think it's very well defined, and there are certain lacunas that can be plugged in. But the first important thing that you need to look at is, what is the problem that we are facing today and how do we address it? Another driving force that determines the emissions or the climate model is the economic and population growth, technological developments, and other aspects which could even include your climatic conditions. Now, even in scientific view, they bring about a bifurcation with regard to weather conditions and climate conditions. So when we're addressing climate policies, what is that you're going to be immediately looking at is also another important framework that you should be addressing. Now, coming to the international negotiation and where India is standing, if you look at, like I stated earlier, we had the UNEP, or the United Nations Human Environment Convention, which happened in 1972. So then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was very focused on stating what India's stance was. And we also said that we accept that environment protection is a must and there is a need to intervene into what's happening. But our main focus would be on reducing our poverty, and also for that purpose we need help from the industrialized or developed nations in the form of finance, science, and technological know-hows or technological transfers. Again, that was not something the developed nations were okay with. When the UNFCCC came into force in 1992, which is basically a framework convention, as many as the conventions keep happening, your framework would never change. So India played a very important role in imbibing or integrating the principle of equity, fairness into the whole concept or the whole framework convention, for not just for us, for the other developing nations also. Because we wanted to ensure that we would only give or we would contribute to the amount that we are emitting. So if you actually looked at the total emission of India at that point of time, we were very little. I mean, we hardly contributed anything. And considering our population and being a developing nation, we had no way that we're going to contribute towards the effects of the developing nations, right? Of the developed nations. That was one of the problems, or one of the evolution in which India's participation was shown. Then in Copenhagen, you'll see a little bit of shift that happened. I mean, you'll see in 2007 to 2009, they were thinking of revising the Kyoto Protocol's plan and to look forward how to go post 2012. And in 2008 is when we came up with our National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was also a reflection of what India's stance was in the international negotiation. Because India started slowly moving towards the whole concept of stating yes, we would also take part. We also had the basic countries which were formulated, which included Brazil, India, and China, and the other nations, where we said yes, we would try and contribute to the limit to as much as we could. So that is where your common but differential treatment came in, which actually was an outcome of the UNFCCC. And in Paris, you see a sea shift in the way we portray ourselves or the way we came up, especially if you look at our national determined contribution. People say it's ambitious, but we have to be ambitious if you want to meet the goal that is set, not just at the domestic level, but also at the international level. Considering that, like I stated earlier, that the US backed out, right now a lot of pressure is on us. So even if you look at our NDCs, we focus a lot on renewable energy. And considering our investment in solar, we are considered to be one of the leading renewable energy producers or establishment of renewables in our country. So one of our major project is in Tumkur. And let's see how it goes forward. But are we actually ready to take this step is another question. If you look at our policy framework, or if you look at our legislative framework, what is in place right now is we have even prior to the NAPAC, we had the National Environment Policy, which is in 2006. I really would ask all of you or urge all of you to look at that model of how the legislators or the drafters have drafted the policy, because it's a very comprehensive policy for environment protection. And they emphasized on some of the important principles of polluter pay and precautionary and sustainable development, which could be used for revamping our existing NAPAC. And another important aspect about our existing policy framework would be that we have the State Action Plan on Climate Change. Now, the next question we need to look at is whether the NAPAC, the SEPAC, which is the State Action Plan on Climate Change, your National Action Plan on Climate Change, are in consonance with your national determined contribution prescribed by India to the Paris Agreement. Is there a link? Is there a gap? Is there a lacuna? What is that we're going to be addressing is another important aspect that we have to be looking into. Now, another thing that most of us are grappling with, or most of us are questioning, is there climate crisis or not? Now, scientists say that there is climate change, and there is no doubt climate crisis is also there, because for the last decade or so, we've been seeing enormous number of impacts, maybe in the form of floods, in the form of droughts, and so on and so forth. And that is indirectly affecting various sectors in our country, including agriculture, including your energy sector, developmental needs, and in the process, it is also affecting poverty, and hence the vicious circle keeps continuing, and our ultimate goal is detrimental, or it's not actually happening. So the first thing that we need to address is how do we bring about a mechanism to mitigate and adapt to climate change? Can we mitigate is another question, because the way the climate impacts are already impacting our country, it is kind of a little hard for us at this stage to mitigate, which I'm again not an expert. I think Ms. Shikha would be in a better position to tell us if there are mitigation solutions. But if you look at the policy frameworks that we are looking at right now, we're always looking at how do you adapt? How do you ensure that each of these sectors are intertwined and interlinked to meet the demands as well as meet your climate needs? Now, coming to your legislative situations, if you look at the existing environmental regime that we have in India, so we have the Environment Protection Act of 1986, which is known as the umbrella legislation for environmental law in India. We do not have any specific provision, or we don't have any specific mention of climate change or greenhouse gas emissions, but we can incorporate the climate impacts or climate analysis into it. How? We have the environment impact assessment, which was brought out in 2006. So when administrators are monitoring or giving approvals to industries, they need to look into climate change or climate impacts also. Right now, we are not. There is a proposition for amending the Environment Protection Act, Environment Impact Assessment 2020. There is a policy draft that is put forward. If the government can look into or integrate climate change as also one of the major components, I think there will be a sea change. Second, coming to your Air Act of 1981, what India could do, or what the judiciary could do, is like how in the United States under the Clean Air Act they have read the provision after the Massachusetts case, where they've read air pollution to include greenhouse gases. We can also include it in our definition of air pollution under the Air Act. Water Act, again, even though it is very restrictive with regard to the pollution of atmospheric climate impacts, you can look at it from ocean acidification, and you can bring in within the purview of water pollution. So with the existing legislative framework, interpretation is possible. There is scope for including climate impacts or climate effects. Another important legislation where you could incorporate or consider climate impacts is the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010. Now, the National Green Tribunal Act does look at problems of environment protection, and in case administrations does not perform their duty, they can impose liability. Why not impose on climate impact offenders who emit emission or greenhouse gases which is beyond the limit prescribed by the authorities? Why not? So that could be another provision that we could look at. Another important piece of legislation is the Biodiversity Act. Considering that biodiversity and climate impacts is closely related, we should have a provision integrating not just for preservation and conservation of the biological resources, but also to ensure impacts of climate change do not have an adverse impact on the ecosystem. So these are the pointers that could be considered while you look at revamping the existing legislative norms. Another important pillar in our constitutional structure is our judiciary. Our judiciary has been a role model, has been has been praised abundantly with regard to its environmental jurisprudence in the country. I think climate litigation has started to be addressed in the court of law, maybe not in the intensity as it should be, but we are going to see a future to climate litigation and probably climate jurisprudence in the near future, considering the number of cases that has been coming before the judiciary. Now, when you look at the structure of a climate change policy, the existing policy of the NAPAC concentrates on more on the energy efficiency aspect. Now, even when you look at energy efficiency, we should look at whether you're ensuring optimal utilization of the resources. Now, another important aspect that has to be kept in mind is, are you able to integrate your developmental needs and your climate needs? Are you bifurcating development and climate change and then looking at a solution? If so, then that is wrong. Now, even before that, another important aspect is politics and policy. Now, if you keep looking at the way the policy framework and your political scenario has been shifting, it is reflected in the way India's position has been in the international forum. So that's something that we already addressed, but it's also important to know what is the focus that is for the government right now and how do you integrate it. So today, if you look at most of our policy regime, including your Electricity Act of 2001, you will see that the government is emphasizing on even utilities to produce certain percentage of energy generation from renewables. So when your government is also promoting renewables, we see that there is still hope. But how do you ensure that it is come into a position where, in case somebody violates, how do you enforce before the court of law is something that we have to look at. So there are a couple of things that I put up on the slides where you could integrate, but this is not an exhaustive list. You have to put in some more sectors, but these are just an illustrative list. So let's just take the energy sector. India has said that yes, we would invest a lot in renewables, but we've also said that we cannot move away from the fossil fuel for a couple of years. Now, how do you strike a balance between both is something that we have to look at. Even when you say we're going to move towards renewable energy, we have to look at whether the people who are working in the renewable energy are skilled laborers or not. Are you actually allocating land as per the regulations where the land is buried or it's probably affected by drought area? Can you convert those areas for renewable energy purposes? If it is an agricultural field, can you actually educate the landowners or the laborers to understand how to use renewable solar energy for better utilization or better crop pattern? Are you integrating or are you ensuring gender parity over here? Now, another important issue that we could address in each of these sector is gender equality. How can women and men, and how are the laws answering both their issues? Now, even when you look at climate disparities, you see the vulnerable sector are mainly the women and children, and mostly those who are coming from the rural India. What happens is most of the time, because of crop failures or because of droughts, the men in the family tend to migrate towards urban areas, and the women are running the household, and they are mainly dependent on the natural resources for livelihood. And hence, obviously, because of the whole cycle of how the climatic condition and how the weather patterns keeps changing, and because of the uncertainties, they are put at a situation where they're always at loss. But if you empower them, and since they are the homemakers and decision makers, can they be the next leaders and change makers is another question that we could address, and how we could bring about gender justice and in the process climate justice, which has been enshrined in your Paris Agreement. Can you actually cater to that is also another question that you could look at. When you look at water, a lot of time when policymakers or when researchers are talking, they talk about water consumption, current pollution, and industrial hazards caused to water. Maybe it's not directly talking about climate, but it's indirectly talking about your climate impacts. So how does your water table affect your climatic condition? How is it interlinked with your climate policy? How do you interlink the existing water policy or water act to the climate development is another question. Agricultural sector, food security is becoming a major issue in India, and it's also affecting the right to livelihood of majority of the population. Now, how do you integrate that into the climate policy is another important area. And the next thing is forest. Now, the forest coverage, the recent UNEP report of 2014 actually states that carbon sinking is very important, and forests can play a very important role in doing so. What is the policy talking about? Is there a percentage prescribed by state action plan stating that so much of forest coverage has to be maintained? Are we following it or not? That's another important area that we have to delve upon. Considering that there are a lot of tribals and indigenous groups living in the forest, how can you make the Joint Forest Act more efficient to ensure that conservation and protection and sustainability is brought about, not just catering to the needs of the nation, but also to a particular class of society is another important area that you could be addressing. Then, well, coming to mitigation and adaptation measures, for each of the sectors, you need to look into mitigation and adaptation, not from a holistic perspective. Reason being, even when it comes to disaster management, does the Disaster Management Act actually address climate issues? Unfortunately, it doesn't. You do not see the terminology climate change or climate impact being addressed. Another important issue that's been coming forward is climate refugees or even internally displaced people. How do you address each of these is one point. The second important point is when you're framing a climate policy, how do you interlink? I know it's not possible to always have a synergy with regard to each of the components. Sometimes it would be a trade-off. But what you as policymakers and as evaluators have to understand is unless and until you integrate or interlink each of these components, you will not get an effective or a what do you say efficient climate regime for India. Now, another thing is we have climate cells, which is very, very well structured today. But what is the role of the state climate cell? What is the role of your national climate cell? We have the Prime Minister's climate council. What does it do? How are they monitoring it? What is your state pollution control board doing? Are they involved in this? So we need to also look at their involvement to monitor. So it's not just your national policy or your judiciary's role, but it's also each and every stakeholder. How do you interlink is what we have to be looking at when you're looking at a climate change policy. I think I've overshoot my time. I can come back with the questions and address some more. I will give the floor to Ms. Shikana, and then I can come back if that's okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, ma'am. I request Shikha ma'am to take over. And ma'am, I think your mic is on mute. We are not able to hear you speak.
Yeah. Hi. Am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Perfect. So, and can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am. We can see your screen.
Okay. So, first of all, thank you, Vidya. Your talk was really very informative and I learned a lot. Thank you, Mr. Nitish and Niti Manthan, for inviting me and giving me this platform to speak. Uh, I am a physical oceanographer. I have not yet worked into policy. I'm mostly into physics and I look at climate change and I work on climate models, do the data analysis to produce results, which can be used later by policymakers. So today I'll be talking about the scientific perspective of climate change. Um, to start off, let's start with the Earth system. So this Earth system on which we live is basically composed of four parts. We have the atmosphere, which is the thin layer of air which we breathe, from where we breathe in. We have a solid earth on which we live, the land, and we have the hydrosphere, which is the water components like lakes, reservoir, lakes, sea, ocean, and all the water bodies, and the biota, which is the living organisms, the ecosystem. All four, atmosphere, hydrosphere, solid earth, and biota, interact with each other and exchange energies. The main source of energy, incoming energy, for all these four components is the solar energy. So we have only one forcing which is coming in, and that is from the sun. The incoming energy is further exchanged between all these four, and a lot of energy is also released back, and that goes out as the heat energy. Now, as we all know, I mean, I think most of us learned this in geography in class in the school that the maximum solar radiation, the maximum heating by the sun is received near the equator, in and around equator, which is basically the tropical region. The poles are the colder areas and the equatorial region is the hottest area on the earth. This heat is being transported from the equatorial region, from the tropical region to the polar region with the help of atmospheric currents as well as oceanic currents. So there are large scale currents which carry these warm waters to the poles and help the weather there to develop. Else it will be really cold in the poles and really hot in the tropical areas. So the ocean is has a thermal inertia, which means that ocean carries this heat slightly slowly slower as compared to how the atmosphere carries it. So basically, both atmosphere and ocean, as I was saying, they exchange energies. They carry heat towards towards for the entire Earth, and this is how the heat balance of the Earth is maintained. Narrowing down to greenhouse effect and further to climate change we'll go. So what exactly is the greenhouse effect? So when the solar radiation comes in, as we'll see in this image, once the solar radiation comes in, the atmosphere is not heated up by the incoming solar radiation. But rather what happens is this Earth absorbs the solar radiation which is coming from the Earth, from the sun, and it emits back uh, long wave radiation. This the energy which is radiated back from the Earth is absorbed by the air molecules. They trap this heat, and then this and they further re-emit this heat. These air molecules have this power of trapping the heat, and this is the greenhouse effect. If we did not have an atmosphere, there would be no trapping of heat, and all the sun's energy which is coming in would be radiated back again. So, for example, if the Earth is at some distance from the sun, if there was no greenhouse gas, I mean, if there was no atmosphere, the temperature of the Earth would have been around minus 18 degrees Celsius. But due to the presence of these gases, which I'm calling now the greenhouse gases, because these are providing that greenhouse effect where they trap in the energy and re-emit to warm the atmosphere, to make it sustainable, to make it livable for us. Because of these greenhouse gases, the temperature is now 15 degrees Celsius, which is good enough for life to sustain, to survive. Temperature on Venus is closer to sun as compared to Earth, but the atmosphere there is much denser. And so the temperature on Venus is around 460 degrees Celsius because they have much more quantity of greenhouse gases as compared to what Earth has. So by this, I am trying to say is that these greenhouse gases are important for the survival of life on Earth. So they have to be there. If they're not there, then it will be very difficult for the Earth to maintain that temperature. So here, since these greenhouse gases are there, we have high warmer temperatures, more than expected. But now in the last few years or last few decades rather, the quantity of these greenhouse gases, the concentration of these greenhouses in the atmosphere has been rising, and this results in higher temperatures. So here is a plot which shows you the annual temperature of annual surface temperatures, and we can see that the graph here is rising. So basically, this is the temperature anomaly, which is the deviation from the mean. So the mean temperature of the Earth is now becoming larger than the temperature of the Earth is becoming larger than the mean temperature. If you look at the the second plot, which is here, the decadal average, this shows how is each decade varying. So how is each decade faring as compared to the previous one? So if we look from 1850 until probably 1980, we will see that the difference between the decades was slight. I mean, they were different, but they were not so different, because if you look at, especially in these four, there was not much variation. But since last 3-4 decades, the difference between the decades is also higher. This means that the rate of increase in temperature is also growing. We are warming much faster than what we were warming before, how we were warming before. This plot here shows how has this temperature, in what regions of the Earth has this temperature increased so much. So the scale here goes from minus 0.7 to 2.5. Purple is the highest color available here. And this shows the hotspots, which areas are getting hotter. I mean, these are the areas which have warmed up most between 1901 to 2012. And if you see the entire, except for in this area in the Atlantic Ocean, everywhere there is a huge warming. So because of these greenhouse gases which are increasing, we are seeing an increasing trend in the surface temperatures as well. But as Vidya was saying, that it is very hard to convince. There are people who still say whether this is a climate crisis or whether are we into climate change or not. So I'll just show you some results. But before that, in 1958, there was a scientist called Charles Keeling, and what he did was he was at Hawaii, and there are mountains in Hawaii. There are volcanoes, active volcanoes. So what he did, he went to a volcano called Mauna Loa, and he set up an observatory there. And the function of this observatory, it was at an altitude of 4,300 meters. The function of this was to only observe the atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's all. It just used to took the measurements of CO2 and record it. The benefit of having an observatory at Mauna Loa was that it was so far away from the rest of the land that there was no impact of the local sources of pollution. So there was no industry which could affect the observations here. So it was assumed that the observations from this observatory would give an idea of what is the global CO2, global measurement of carbon dioxide. So this data is provided by Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and they provide it daily. They are updating it daily. This is from until June 12th, which is like 3 days back. And this plot here shows the CO2 concentration in parts per million from 1958 until 2020. ppm means parts per million, which means that if you have 1 million particles of air molecules, out of that, there is one molecule. I mean, how many molecules are there in 1 million molecules of air? So if we have a concentration of CO2 today, somewhere around 416, maybe, that means in 1 million molecules of air, you have 416 molecules of CO2. Now, if you see, this graph has been increasing ever since. That means the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has been increasing. And I mean, this in itself is an indisputable graph which shows that CO2 has been increasing. Even with if you go to the website and if you look at last 3 months data, even with the pandemic and with all the air travel stopped, you will see that there has not been much difference to CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That means we need to do a lot more than just stopping the air travel, probably. To look into this from a broader view, so this observatory was set up in 1958. So what scientists can get the data from ice cores, from using paleo techniques to find the concentration in the atmosphere before 1958, and when they did that to see how the concentration varied, this shows that before that also the CO2 concentration was much less, and in the last few years it has shooted up. Even if this is not convincing, then there are techniques to get much older data. And now here you see the time axis is in thousands of years. So since 800,000 years back till today, there has been a natural cycle of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. When I say natural cycle, it means that the Earth is able to regulate its CO2. If it increases, it is able to regulate it back to something less, to a lesser number, and then once it can increase again and decrease again. It is something like seasons. We have higher temperatures in the months of May and June, and then lower temperatures in December and January. So we have a cycle in temperature. The Earth can regulate the CO2 also. It's natural CO2 also. But if you look at the last few years, in terms of this scale, the spike is so strong and so significantly high. That means this is definitely not a part of the natural cycle of Earth. This is not, it cannot be. I mean, seeing this data, it has never shot beyond 300 probably, and today it's more than 400 ppm. How does this natural cycle come into action? I'll just show you a glimpse of it. So we all studied in geography in the school that the Earth revolves around the sun and rotates on its axis. So on the time scales of 100,000 years, that means in 100,000 years, the orbit kind of changes. It becomes shorter and then it becomes longer. And this happens at a time scale of 100,000 years, which is very slow. So we will not notice it particularly, but it happens. There is a change in obliquity of the Earth as well. That means this tilt, which is right now 23.5 degrees, it also varies from 22.1 to 24.5. And the precision, which is how is it wobbling, that also keeps on changing. And the time scale is around 26,000 years. So based on these three things, it decides how close or how far is it from the sun. And this will change the solar radiation. This will change how much of the heat is being trapped by CO2 and how much is the temperature warmer or cooler. And hence, these three things kind of decide if the CO, if the warmth is less, if the temperatures are lower, there may be some life which may not exist, and so the CO2 might increase or decrease accordingly. And that is how the Earth regulates its natural cycle. But this part is something which is not dedicated to these. This is called the Milankovitch cycles. So definitely the last part is not dedicated to the Milankovitch cycles. Now, to understand all of this better, uh, all the scientists and all the people who are working into climate have come up with climate models. We need models to understand things better. We need models to predict, for forecasting, and for a lot of things. I mean, this is how we are going to now see, probably foresee the future and then make policies to prevent it from happening. So how a model is developed is that we take the Earth, we divide it into using longitudes and latitudes into grid boxes. There are, all the physical processes which we know are modeled in these. That means it has precipitation, it has heat transfer between the Earth, between the ocean and the atmosphere. It has water transfer. There will be, if there is evaporation, there will be precipitation between the land and the ocean. Between the land and atmosphere, there is convection. That means the formation of clouds and the formation and the rains on the land. So all the physical processes which we know are then solved at each and every grid point of this model. And then once this model is run for a longer, for the stipulated period of time, then we analyze the outputs, and then we use those plots to understand what is happening. So for example, I'll just give a very short example here. Let's assume that the sun is shining here and it gives some solar radiation on this grid. Can you see my cursor also? I hope so.
Yes, ma'am, your cursor is visible.
Okay, perfect. So let's assume that there is a sun here which is shining, and there is some radiation which is coming to the atmosphere here. Now this gray portion is the atmosphere. It will pass through all these three grid points to reach the Earth. In between, if there is any aerosol, if there is any particle, or let's say a cloud is there which can reflect it back or scatter it back, then that radiation will change. The value of radiation will definitely change, and the amount of radiation which reaches here, now the land decides how much to absorb, how much to scatter, how much to reflect, and that energy balance takes place at this grid cell. And this is how energy is now, and this grid cell and the next grid cell will then decide how much to transfer. So all of this is decided on is calculated with the help of physics, the physical laws, and this is how a model is then run. Since it is a model and not a real Earth, we have the benefit that we can run test cases with it. That means we can run this model as it is today. As the Earth is today with the current scenario, we can run it in a way so that we can, in a manner such that we can increase the carbon dioxide to 4 times of what it is today and see what happens later. We can run it with half of carbon dioxide or half of emissions of today and see what happens later. So these are the benefits which we get out of model, and then we analyze them to get results. So I think you all know already about IPCC. So Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1990, and it basically became a very strong body after it received the Nobel Prize in 2007 for promoting understanding on climate change and policies. So what IPCC does it, so there are various centers across the world who have these climate models. It is very expensive to run these climate models because they take a lot of computational powers. You need a very big, you need a strong high performance computing resource available to you to make this model run. Else it's very, very expensive affair. So not all the nations and not everybody has a climate model. So there are certain, I think there are more than 23 centers across the world who have these climate models. And IPCC and these climate, there's a body called CMIP. They together decide a set way on what kind of experiments to run. All the climate centers run similar kind of experiments, and they all combine their results to make one result. And then on the basis of how, I mean, since all of them are running the same experiment, the it is easier to identify how significant the output is. Because if you have just one model running, and if you have just one output, you are not sure if that is correct. If you have just two, then if and both of them give different results, it will be hard to decide which one to, which one to choose. How do you know which one is correct or which one is wrong? That is why when all these centers come together and give you the result, you take a combined effect of all of them so that any such anomalies are taken care of. So using them now, there are various scenarios, as I was saying, that we can run different experiments with these. There are various scenarios which are defined by IPCC, and one of them is RCP. RCP is Representative Concentration Pathway. RCP 2.6, RCP 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5. So I'll just put it into simpler words. RCP 2.6 is a scenario in which we assume that we have used our carbon, we have emitted our carbon to until 2020, and after 2020 we do not our emissions do not peak. Our emissions start declining after 2020. So this is the best case scenario. So since right now we are into 2020, if we just stop emitting anything and let our carbon emissions decline, then then that scenario will be called as RCP 2.6. The other extreme is RCP 8.5, which means that we let the business go as usual. We do not make any changes in our lives. Let nobody do anything about climate, and let people live as they are living. And so that is the next worst case scenario. So in these, all the figures later on, I'll be comparing the best case scenario and the worst case scenario here. So looking at the average surface temperature change, this is until 2005. If we consider 2005 as the base year, if we go with the best case scenario where our emissions start declining from today onwards, it is seen that the temperature still rises a little bit, but thereafter becomes stagnant. But this temperature is still higher than what it was in 2005. So even if you stop your emissions today, your temperatures will not decrease, not until 2100 at least. If you go for the worst case scenario now, since you're not stopping your carbon emissions, that means your GHGs are increasing. The surface temperature also rises, and by the end of the century, it could be the difference between 2005 and at the end of the century could be as high as 4 degrees Celsius. This is a very high, drastic jump in the surface temperature actually. If you look at the sea ice extent, sea ice in the northern hemisphere, in 2005, if it is somewhere around slightly less than 6 into 10 to the power 6 square kilometers, in the best case scenario, it reduces to around 3, which is half of sea ice. So this figure shows how scary it is, because even if you stop everything today, probably we are already very late into this, but even if you stop today everything, your temperatures will still increase and your sea ice will reduce to its half. If you don't do anything, it will reduce to 0 by the end of the century. And this is about the ocean acidification, as Vidya was also saying. So marine life is a very important part of our ecosystem. And if we go on increasing the temperatures, the acidity of the ocean also changes, because since there is a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean acts as a sink and it tries to absorb all the carbon dioxide which is present in the atmosphere. Once the CO2 is dissolved, there's a chemical reaction which goes on, which breaks it into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And these hydrogen ions help to increase the pH of increase the acidity of the global ocean. If the ocean becomes, right now the ocean is at a pH of around 8, slightly more than 8, 8.15, 8.1. And if the ocean becomes more acidic, our marine life will be affected, fishes will be affected, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and probably the ocean also, the the strength of the ocean to absorb more CO2 will also decrease. So it will become much warmer. And in the best case scenario, the pH, the ocean becomes slightly more acidic, reduces only by a certain amount, 0.05. But in the worst case scenario, I'm sorry, it becomes so much more acidic, and this is going to have a great impact. It will have an impact even on the circulation later on. So this figure here, this plot here, shows you uh, in these three terms how is climate change going to impact us with the help of models. Definitely, we don't know if this is, I mean, we are sure that this is going to be there, but of course we cannot be 100% sure because there are errors in the models as well. But this is the speculation which IPCC has released. In case of sea level rise, in the worst case scenario, the sea level will increase by slightly less than 80 centimeters. 80 centimeters is such a huge number. Most of our islands will just vanish. And India, which has such a long coastline, there are so many people who live along the coastline whose livelihood depends upon, I mean, upon the activities going around the coastline. It is very, very scary for them. And as Vidya was also mentioning about the extreme events which are happening in India, right now, just, I mean, the monsoon has just begun, and we already had two very disastrous cyclones this year. So we don't know, I mean, it's very hard to say how are things going to change. Extreme events are increasing now. We are not no more there. The mean which was there, there was a thing which was called, so there's a normal weather, no mean weather. I think that mean has also now increased. It is no more the same mean as we were living in. And this plot here shows the average surface temperature in the best case scenario and in the worst case scenario. In case if we stop our emissions today, that as I was mentioning the previous plot, the temperatures will change, but the magnitude of temperature change is slightly lesser. There are still higher temperatures on the land as compared to oceans, and the poles, especially the North Pole, seems to be affected a lot. In case of the worst case scenario, the difference of temperature can go as high as 9 to 10 degrees Celsius or 12 degrees Celsius in the poles, and the entire globe is affected. This is the change in precipitation, which shows that in the worst case scenario, the precipitation pattern will change so much that these thick bands of dark color show the high precipitation areas, but most of the areas will have such less precipitation, so there will be large deserts which will be forming probably. There will be oceanic deserts as well as land deserts. This is a clip which I hope works, and then which shows how has the sea ice changed between 84 to 2016. So here is the time which is going on, and this plot here shows the age of the ice. The white color is the older ice, more than 4 years old, and the lighter colors are new ice, fresh ice, which is formed. So this started in 1984. I hope you remember the first image, and let's go up to probably 2005 or so, and you will see how the sea ice has changed. So it also has a cycle, obviously, because in the summer months, because northern hemisphere experiences summer uh, during during its summer season, there will be melting, but during its winter season, more ice formation will take place. So we are already in 2004. And see what happens in the recent decade. So 2010. A lot of old ice which was there has vanished now. Very little of it is present. That means, so this is September 2016, and all of you can easily compare how it was in the beginning and how it was in the end. So this shows that a lot of warming is taking place, and it is affecting, since these glaciers, the ice is melting here, it is giving rise to higher sea levels, and because of higher sea levels, a lot of land area is drowning in. People are, apart from, I mean, the society is getting affected as well. The energy balance of the atmosphere of the earth is also changing. So this is a recent figure which has been released just recently by IPCC, which talks about what happens to the ocean, what will happen to the ocean due to this climate change. So so this is the legend, but the snow cover and the glacier mass will decrease because of the increasing temperatures. Sea ice will decrease. Ice sheet mass in Greenland and Antarctica will also decrease. Sea level will increase, which will have a drastic impact. The capacity of ocean to absorb oxygen will decrease. That means it will affect marine life. pH will decrease. That means ocean will become more acidic. Heat content will increase. It will become much more warmer. And so if ocean becomes warmer, but there are marine heat waves, just like we have atmospheric heat waves where we have few days when the temperatures are so high and the winds are so hot. Even in the ocean, there are days when the water is extremely high, when the ocean currents bring a lot of hot water from one area. And so it affects the local life there. So we will have we will have more marine heat waves going on in the ocean. All of the systems interact with each other. So it is not that, I mean, we cannot single out one of them and say that we can stop this from happening. Because if you have to stop one, you have to stop others also. The entire climate system is so much linked to each other, and it is tightly coupled to each other. So it is very hard to just stop one thing and assume that if we stop doing some particular thing, everything, I mean, then other thing will improve. It might not be so. For example, if there are a lot of clouds, the sea surface temperatures will decrease. If the sea surface if it becomes colder, then it can lead to the pressure balance in the ocean surface can change, which can change the wind patterns, which can further change the rain conditions in some different place. So it's hard in the climate system to single out one component. It is all very tightly linked. And I would like to end with this one. So at IITM, where I work, Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, we have been trying to write a report which would be very similar to IPCC report, but it will be only for the Indian region. And we have written a book here, which is the assessment of climate change over the Indian region. It will be released on 19th of this month at 4 o'clock in the evening by Dr. Harshvardhan. So this book has been written with an idea that it can be helpful for the policymakers to understand what is going on in and around the Indian region from a scientific perspective. So it has chapters on land use, land cover, air, atmospheric chemistry, ocean, sea level, and all such variables. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that presentation. We have gaining such scientific knowledge with relation to climate change is something that is extremely necessary for us.
Ajit, sorry to interrupt you, but your voice is echoing.
I'm really sorry about that. Is it better now?
Yes, much better.
Thank you. Quickly proceeding on to the questions that we have received. We have received around 4 questions right now. The first question is from one of our interns, Dadich, which has been addressed to both the speakers. There is no. The question is, talking about adaptation strategies, we see the unequal effect of climate change in the context of class structure. Communities at the lower ends of the pyramid are affected more and directly compared to those upper ends. Ironically, these communities at the upper end are the ones majorly responsible for the environmental damage due to the capitalist economic system driven by a culture of consumerism and high energy consumption. What can be the framework followed while designing policies or laws reforming the consumption-based economies, intervening in the private spaces of higher classes, envisioning responsible or sustainable growth rather than economic growth. Additionally, is the idea of Keynesian green economics of no low growth possible?
I think I will take the question first, and then probably Ms. Shikha could add on. Excellent question. I mean, that's one of our major concerns that I think the legislators have been grappling with. How do you actually restrict? I mean, that's also not just at a domestic level, but even if you look at the international level, that's exactly the point. How do you give restriction to only certain class of people? How do you ensure sustainable development, and how do you ensure there is co-benefit action? If you actually look at our NAPAC model, it works on co-benefit model, which actually looks at climate gain and development. The only way that industrialists or the consumption or unequal distribution of energy efficiency can be better sustained would be first ensure that the laws are stringent with respect to resource utilization. Let there be no accumulation of wealth when it comes to resource allocation. So if you're going to move towards renewable energy, you need to enhance or try models or policies like, I'm not saying US could be the best model, but some of the states have taken up initiatives wherein they have included something called Green Energy Fund or Energy Trust. For example, Oregon has something called Energy Trust of Oregon. So what they do is a part of the electricity fund from industrialized areas or from a higher class of the society who's consuming more, the amount is used for the lower sector for installing renewables. Can India do that? The second thing that they also have is something called community solar projects, wherein incentives are given to install, and also incentives are given to large industries to set up their utilities near low income or middle income groups, so that you're giving employment to them. At the same time, you're providing renewable energy, you're giving them access and skill for development. So that could be a model that we could use. But yes, your concern, excellent doubt and excellent question. It is one of the issues that we are grappling with, and the incentives and policy model could enhance the position in a better manner, I think.
Thank you, ma'am. That question was asked by Dadich and in the climate change project of Niti Manthan. The second question is from Sahaj Mathur, who is also an intern with the climate change project. Vidya ma'am, this question is for you. The question is as follows. Do you believe that an economic free rider problem exists in the creation of climate change policies internationally? This question is being raised specifically in terms of the actual incentives that a country will have to invest in climate change measures, considering that the impact aren't merely seen on their own country, but on the environment in general.
I'm sorry, Ajit, your voice was kind of breaking. Could you just tell me again? I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry about the word. Sahaj Mathur has asked.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you believe that an economic free rider problem exists in the creation of climate change policies internationally?
Okay.
This question is being raised specifically in terms of the actual incentives that a country may have to invest in climate change measures, considering that the impacts aren't merely seen on their own country, but on the environment in general.
Considering climate change is not jurisdictional, or it's something which cannot be addressed by a single party, and the whole concept of climate negotiation is to bring about fairness and equity among nations. So if you look at economic benefits, irrespective of whether a particular country is affected or not, ultimately they are going to be affected. I mean, climate change, please understand, is not a concern of US or India. No, it is actually a global concern today. You cannot say one country is not affected and the other country is. So when a differentiation is brought out, it is just to give them a pedestal or to just put like I think in economics analysis they've given these diagrams where they put a brick for someone to stand and then look over the fence to see a cricket show, and there's a tall boy and a short boy. So it's just bringing about the equity of fairness there. You can't say it's a free riding principle. That's again, it's my personal opinion, but anybody can refute it. It's completely fine.
Thank you, ma'am. This next question is for Shikha, ma'am. Achiti asks, when building the bridge from science to policy, how should one conduct policy-focused assessments which identify key stresses of the scientific regime, such as human health assessment or population adaptability and weather or climate-related hazards?
Yeah. So the thing is, we need a platform where scientists and policymakers can come together and work, I mean, and design experiments which can be of benefit to both the parties. It has been happening. I'm not sure. I mean, I am sure you guys would know better. But as far as I know, it has been happening so far in India as well. Because while we were writing this book, there were many policymakers which came to us and asked us to mention certain perspectives which would help them to design their policies in a better manner. I mean, they gave us certain guidelines of please make sure you write about this or please make sure you write about that. So I think the for every problem to be solved, there's a need for people from different areas to come together and formulate the problem and formulate the steps together. The more the diversity helps in this. So, as scientists, if we don't know that you need this output, we might not ever design that experiment. We may do something which will be of because if we want to understand something, we may design an experiment according to our needs only. So I think there's a need of a platform. That's all for this to happen.
Thank you, ma'am, for that answer. The next question is again by Achiti to Shikha, ma'am. Ma'am, the question is as follows. Does India have a center which runs climate models? If not, and if we were to get inspired from any other nation's model, whose example should we follow?
Okay, very good question, and this is a point which I missed in my talk as well. So until IPCC has been into action since 1990, and the last assessment report by IPCC was released in 2014, 13 and 14. Until then, India did not have a climate model. But after that, IITM, where I work, Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, had started working on developing a climate model for India itself. And in the next assessment report, which will be released next year, the experiments are already completed and now the reports are being written these days. It is going under review. So India is now, for the first time, India is going to contribute into IPCC's results. India has a climate model of its own. It is run by IITM. It is supported by Ministry of Earth Sciences. And there are other stakeholders also involved who are using those. We have an HPC facility which is used to run this climate model. There are other stakeholders which also use our HPC facility to do the analysis, to do their research. And it's a proud moment for us that we are going to contribute to it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that answer. The next question is to Vidya, ma'am, and is being posed by Radhika. Radhika asks, how should we increase climate jurisprudence if we have for an out-of-court settlement for climate crimes?
How do we increase climate jurisprudence?
If there are means that exist for an out-of-court settlement for climate crimes?
Okay, as of now, unfortunately, we do not have any out of court settlements that have been laid down. The model that we have been relying on is the climate litigation process that is followed in the US. And the first case that was addressed by the judiciary in India was in 2005, which was a Karnataka case. And what was looked at was the impact of converting agricultural land for industrial purpose and the adverse impact on climate change. So that was the first instance. So from there forward, we actually don't have, unfortunately, any jurisprudence or any guidelines to say how to go forward. But there is a process that the NGT and the courts could come up with, wherein they could charge industries, especially when they are charging for air pollution and for even with respect to violation or flouting the laws of the environment impact assessment. They could integrate emission of greenhouse gases, since it's not been mentioned and since they've not brought gaseous substance and they've not incorporated greenhouse gases within that purview, they could interpret it, which would be a huge change in how India would be looking at climate change or climate litigation. And another issue that we're also grappling with is interface between climate change and human right violation. There are humongous number of human right violations because of climate change. Again, that's another area which can be invoked before the court of law, but unfortunately till now we've not got a substantive reason for the courts to address this issue, but we could see it in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for that answer. The next question is to Shikha, ma'am, from Kumail. Kumail asks, a lot of extraction is conducted in Arctic regions as it holds a lot of resources, but it destroys the permafrost, which is said to hold a staggering 1,800 billion tons of carbon and methane. How can we resolve such issues by only adopting mitigation methods?
Okay, so that's something which is out of the scope of my knowledge. So I'm not a subject matter expert on it. But I think when they decide decide these spots to be drilled for conducting their observational studies, there's a body which helps in uh, which I mean, you have to have your observation, your experiment approved by a body which looks into this matter, that you are not destroying the natural resources completely. Since we have to have the data, we need to go in those regions and extract. So it is also important, but I really am not sure about how to do this. So I'm sorry. I do not have the right answer for you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Of course, our interns will further research into this topic. Thank you for your guidance. Then this next question is to Vidya, ma'am, being asked by Pratiksha. Pratiksha asks, when we talk about integrating gender into climate change, could we go beyond the existing gender binary roles to include the LGBTQ community? And if so, how do we move forward?
Excellent question. I mean, this is something that is been kind of debated and even written about in some of the US literature as to how do you, so when you talk about gender justice, is it just limited just to a stereotype class that has been prescribed or stated by the society, or do you look at different kind of gender issues that are cropping up in today's scenario? Well, one, that's exactly why when you're actually looking at climate policy, you need to link or interlink societal needs depending on different perspectives. So even when you're talking about gender justice, it need not be just women. It could be even your transgender community who is actually affected and nobody cares about them. But they have the potential to change a lot. But how many of the policymakers or how many of the what do you say, evaluators or economic analysis actually go into their problems? Not many. But if you actually integrate them, if you actually equip them, even they are in a lot of, so if you actually look at the gender injustice that are happening, one of the things that women face, what do you say, researchers talk about is they are prone to human trafficking. More than them, the transgenders are actually being human trafficked to a large extent because of climate change. The reason being, when they move from one place to another because of their livelihood being affected or because of the homes being affected, they go to a place where they're prone to being, being where their rights are being violated. So if there are let's not talk about policymakers. If the administration at the grassroots level, be it at the local and municipal level, takes steps to help them, to educate them, train them with skills of renewable energy, I think the world will change for better. So it's not just restricted to men and women. I'm sorry if I made that kind of an example. Gender justice for me would be looking at each and every person in the society, needs of each and every person or gender persistent in today's day. So, thank you.
This is another question that is again being posed by Pratyusha to Vidya ma'am. Policy formation and legislative measures heavily depend on the political agendas and governments, which reflect people's immediate needs. Also, understanding how all countries aim for economic development, which is often seen to have an inverse relationship with environmental replenishment. What should be prioritized until what extent, according to you, especially in a post-corona world?
Okay, taking from corona period, there have been again a lot of write-ups and research saying that there has been a reviving model of the environment, or what we could learn is how the administrators have used lockdown and other steps in getting people to do what they want to do, which basically means if you want to bring in an adaptation or mitigation mechanism and you want climate change impacts to not have adverse impact, government can do something, and which is proved by the government. I think you guys would have seen the video, or some of you would have come across this video of River Ganga. They showed how it was revived by its own course because people were not allowed to go near River Ganga and pollute it. Same way, can the administrators bring in mechanism? I'm not saying completely lockdown, but face down emission from industries in a manner to help environmental reduction of environmental pollution. Second, also look at solution of economic development. And one of the models that people are proposing today for India is renewable energy. They say since renewable energy is cheap, since renewable energy is affordable, people transforming into the energy model since as a
Vidya ma'am,
sure, go ahead.
Ma'am, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but your voice has been breaking. So if you could
Oh,
just
okay.
please repeat your last two sentences, it would be advantageous for our audience.
Yeah, sure. So basically, what should be done by the government is look at a systematic model which is going to be efficient and practical. And since we already are following the co-benefit model, and environment is one of the stands or one of the strands of development, how do you integrate it in a more efficient manner is what the government should do. So one solution for it is the punishments or the way administrators are enforcing it should be more stringent. Second, there should be an interlink between municipal, local, state, and central government policies to ensure that all of them have the same ideology and same framework. Thank you, Ajit. I think that
All right, ma'am. There are a few more questions that are
go
in
ahead.
right now. So the next question is being asked by Radhika, who says, how much of lobbying and deep pockets of industries influence climate policy locally and internationally?
So, okay. I cannot kind of talk about it as much, but from the literature, what I've read, if you look at even in the Paris Agreement, they have included non-state actors, which include big oil companies. And you would be surprised to see that companies like Shell and other companies have voluntarily gone forward and said that we will move towards the renewable energy and we'll try and shift from fossil fuel. So at the international level, I don't know how far, I don't know the details of what the companies are doing, but on the face of it, they are putting forward proposition saying that they are going to move towards renewable energy and help the country and the society at large to reduce emission. At state level, or at local level, or at domestic level, see, industries would play an important role in the policy decision making. Why? Because they are the backbone of the economy of the country. So, in a in a way, the government does side with them. But if there is an alternative solution for these fossil industries or huge industries, in the form of incentives, or in the form of taking off their burden from the carbon emission, they would move forward. So I think incentives would be a good framework. But for a country like India, one major problem is we need finance and technology. And if international governments like the US was willing to do it post Trump withdrawal, he said no more technological know-hows or financial help. So again, we are at a very bad situation. But if we do get the financial assistance and technological know-hows, I think we can move faster.
Thank you, ma'am. We have two last questions. This question is open to both our speakers. Harita asks, in light of the current pandemic and with economic revivalist tendencies around the globe, what would be the impact on climate change commitments of countries?
I think I'll let Shikha ma'am talk, and then I will take up, because I've been answering a couple of them. So
Yes,
Yeah, yeah. I think it will be hard for the countries to come forward and to maintain their commitments, considering the economy. For example, if we take India itself, um right now we are in a state where, I mean, the government, it will be very difficult for the government to put restrictions for the revival of put restrictions on processes, so that, I mean, which can hamper the revival of economy. So especially for developing nations like us, like ours, it will be, I think it will be very difficult. But for a country like the US, I am not really sure what will happen, because I'm not aware if they really did anything for the pandemic. There were slight lockdown, there were like lockdowns in certain states, but they are a capitalist economy, and so they went on. I mean, they did not stop themselves from growing. It will affect the developing nations for sure. That's what I mean. Their commitments for sure. Vidya, maybe you can explain it better. I'm not. I mean, yeah. Please go
No,
ahead.
so no, I completely agree with what Shikha ma'am stated. One more thing that analysts have been saying is that there needs to be much more study that has to be conducted to understand the interrelation between COVID and climate change, or with regard to COVID and the economic stance. As much as the analysis have come out, we still don't know if it is the outcome of COVID or not. And how has countries kind of reacted to it? Well, what we should be doing right now is praying that COVID comes to an end, uh, because none of the countries are happy with what's happening. US has opened up the economy, irrespective of whether their numbers are going down or going up. India cannot afford to lock down any further because we don't have finance anymore. So in such a condition, how is it going to impact climate change and climate negotiation? Well, the Paris Agreement is there to stay. So the fight for climate change is there to stay. So the impacts of whether the lockdown has had a revival tendency for the nature, it's too soon to actually come to a conclusion on that.
Yeah, I would like to also add here that probably this is an opportunity when we are going to start off with things. I mean,
Yeah.
we are going to bring in new policies like for Make in India and other things, especially for our country. Uh, this is the time when we can actually choose a way forward which is more green, which is more eco-friendly for the country and for our emission control. But I'm not sure what the government will decide. I mean, this is what I know, that we have two way forward right now. We have both the paths open, and it's on us to decide. But the eco-friendly way might be slightly expensive for us to afford right now. So yeah, that's all. Thanks.
This is the last question that is being asked as a follow-up to his question by Sahej. Sahej had initially asked a question about the free riding problem existing in environmental legislation. His follow-up states as follows. On a practical level, how can you get developed nations to more concretely adhere to the obligations under the environmental framework? More specifically, owing to the seemingly tokenistic contributions they make repeatedly, but are not enough to combat the problems of climate change in developing countries?
Excellent question, Sahaj. I really wish I could give you a concrete answer to that. But right now, how the Paris Agreement models is they go by name and shame model, which basically says that if you do not follow your NDCs or do not keep up with your strategies that you have set up, then the whole world is going to look down upon you. The problem with developed nations is that, or why the reason why developing nations like India or other countries would not try to impose or bring up issues against developed nation is we're not just having ties with them for climate change or for technological know-how. There are so many other foreign policies which needs the diplomatic relations to go forward. So if I tamper with my one of my policies, then I'm kind of putting my whole country into doomsday. So I don't want to do that, right? So, I mean, the policy for the Paris model is a good way forward, where they say that if you're not going to follow, the other countries are, trying to put your trade maybe would be blocked, or they're going to put your certain other kind of restrictions, which indirectly would put you on the blacklist. So let's see how it works. Too soon to come to a conclusion. But what all of us have to remember as policymakers, as law students, as think tanks, is that there is no time for thinking about anything. We need to look at practical solutions and how to at least take a baby steps to ensure that we do not kill ourselves. That's something that the world at large has to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikha ma'am and Vidya ma'am, for those really enlightening answers. The time is now reached to conclude the webinar. As policymakers postulating a new policy for dealing with climate change in India, it was imperative for us to have a comprehensive understanding of both the legal situation in India along with a solid scientific backing. Today from Vidya ma'am, we learned the necessary policy changes that need to be brought about in India with relation to climate change. And from Shikha ma'am, we were given an opportunity to understand the magnanimity of the scientific backing and the importance of the scientific backing that needs to exist in terms of climate change policies in India. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank Vidya ma'am and Shikha ma'am for taking the time out of their schedules to speak at our webinar. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Nitish and Madhav for initiating the Nityanathan Summer School and offering interns such a great arena for learning and development. I would also like to thank at this point my colleague Ajti Batra for creating this project and for being able and for supporting all our interns and me through this project. That brings us to the end of this seminar. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you Shikha ma'am and Vidya ma'am once again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure interacting with all of you, and really hope that your project comes to light. And always remember that we're all here to support you guys. And if there's anything that you need, please let us know. We'll be more than happy to help you further. Thank you once again.
Yeah, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me here. It was a very informative session for me, and I learned a lot from all of you, from the questions as well as from how Vidya was answering them. Thank you. And if you have any questions with respect to scientific part of it, please go ahead and you can always email me. I'll be happy to answer your queries.